He thought attacking the judge would break the courtroom's power structure, but Judge Ellis's response left him, and everyone else, speechless. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound that filled the space, echoing faintly against the hard marble floors. Charles Whittaker sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling ever so slightly. His wide, tired eyes scanned the room, but his focus kept returning to the person at the front, Judge Naomi Ellis. She was an imposing figure, her demeanor calm, but exuding authority. A black woman in a position of power in this predominantly white courthouse was not something most of the spectators were accustomed to. They watched, some with curiosity, others with open skepticism. But Judge Ellis wasn't bothered. She had earned her place there long before this trial began. Charles Whittaker had never imagined his life would lead him here. A middle-aged man with a troubled past. This was the culmination of years of poor decisions. Now, he was facing serious charges that could lock him away for 20 years. His mind raced as he heard the charges being read aloud: theft, assault, and more. The words felt like they were in a different language, far removed from his reality. Yet, the reality of it all was sinking in. He had always been good at talking his way out of trouble. But today was different. Today, he wasn't standing before just any judge. Judge Ellis had a reputation that reached beyond the courthouse walls. She wasn't one to be intimidated, nor was she one to show mercy without a valid reason. Charles didn't know it yet, but he was about to test her patience in the most dangerous way possible. The courtroom was silent as the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Leslie Hayes, began to outline the case against Whittaker. Her voice was steady and filled with confidence, contrasting starkly with the shaking hands of the man who stood accused. Whittaker's lawyer, a quiet man named George Patterson, seemed to shrink into the background, barely making a sound. Whittaker's fate, it seemed, was already decided in the eyes of the prosecution, but Charles wasn't ready to surrender just yet. His eyes darted around the room, trying to find some kind of escape. His gaze landed on Judge Ellis again. She was flipping through her notes, scanning them as if she had already seen everything and everyone in the room 1,000 times before. She looked unbothered. But Charles could feel the weight of her attention on him. And that was when it hit him. He wasn't going to get out of this. Not with words, not with charm, and certainly not with whatever tricks he had up his sleeve. Whittaker's anxiety grew by the second. Sweat began to form on his brow, despite the coolness of the courtroom. He wiped it away, his gaze darting nervously between the prosecutor and Judge Ellis. He was a man backed into a corner, with nowhere to turn. The stakes were too high, and his options too few. As the prosecutor continued to speak, Charles's mind started to spiral. The pressure was unbearable, and for a fleeting moment he entertained the idea of simply walking out of that courtroom and running, but he knew it was too late for that. The trial was already underway, and his fate was in the hands of this woman, Judge Naomi Ellis. But little did he know, the next few moments would set the stage for an unimaginable turn of events. The courtroom felt colder as the minutes dragged on. Every word spoken by the prosecutor seemed to inch Charles closer to the inevitable. The evidence against him was mounting. Surveillance footage of his alleged theft, eyewitness testimonies of his violent outbursts, and his own criminal record, which was beginning to feel like a thick, unending list of mistakes, had all but sealed his fate. Charles couldn't focus on the details anymore. His mind was clouded with panic. He couldn't think straight. His heart thudded against his chest like a drum, drowning out everything else. He glanced over at his lawyer, George Patterson, who was scribbling notes in a pad, offering nothing but the faintest nods in his direction. There was no comfort to be found in the man who was supposed to defend him. Judge Naomi Ellis remained impassive, a silent observer, yet her presence weighed heavily on Charles. He couldn't help but wonder how she could sit there with such poise. Didn't she see what was at stake here? Didn't she know how desperate he was? To her, he was just another case. But to him, this trial was everything. As the prosecutor, Leslie Hayes, spoke about the severity of the crimes, Charles's mind began to race. His life was in tatters. How had it come to this? How had he ended up in a courtroom with his future hanging by a thread? A thought crossed his mind. What if he could get out of this? What if, in the chaos, he could find a way to escape? But escape wasn't possible. Not now. Not here. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the prosecutor turned to present the final piece of evidence. Charles's last encounter with a store clerk who had been assaulted in one of the thefts. The victim was set to testify in a few minutes, and Charles could feel the crushing weight of their testimony already. "I think we're ready to hear from the defendant now." Judge Ellis's voice broke the stillness, sharp and commanding. She addressed the room as though there was no room for hesitation. Charles's throat went dry. He had been hoping to avoid speaking, but now his moment had come. His lawyer gave him a slight nudge, his expression unreadable. He stood, trying to push the fear back into the corners of his mind. His legs were shaky as he approached the stand, his palms clammy as he placed them on the wood. He forced himself to look up at the judge. Her eyes met his, cool and calculating. It was as if she could see through him, as though she knew exactly what he was thinking. But Charles was used to manipulation. He had been good at getting by on charm and lies. He was about to try it again, hoping, praying, that it would be enough. "I didn't do what they're accusing me of," Charles began, his voice trembling slightly at first. "I'm not the person they say I am. I've made mistakes, sure, but I'm not a criminal. I was in a bad place, but I'm better now. I'm trying to turn things around." Judge Ellis didn't flinch. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Charles continued, his words more desperate, more frantic as he fought to regain control. "I've got family, a wife, kids. They need me," he added, his voice breaking as he thought about the people he was trying to protect. His voice was starting to gain momentum, the adrenaline of the moment pushing him forward. "I've made some bad choices, but that doesn't define me." The courtroom was silent. The words hung in the air, his pleas falling on deaf ears. Or so he thought. He had tried every angle. The remorse, the appeal to family, the promise of change. But it wasn't working. The weight of his past was too much to lift, and it was suffocating him. He could feel his hands shaking now, his confidence slipping through his fingers. Judge Ellis sat unmoved, her eyes still locked on him. But the tension was about to shift, and Charles was about to make a decision that no one in that courtroom could have predicted. Charles could feel the room closing in on him. The weight of his own words seemed to press down harder with every breath he took. His throat was dry, his palms slick against the wooden stand. This wasn't how he had imagined things going. He had hoped that by speaking up, he could sway them, show them that he was more than the charges he faced. But instead, his words had only seemed to highlight the distance between him and the courtroom. It wasn't working. Nothing was working. Judge Ellis's gaze was unrelenting. She sat there, stoic and calm, as if she had heard it all before. To her, Charles was just another defendant, a face in a long line of criminals. It was as if she was already preparing her verdict, and that realization sent a wave of panic through him. He felt like a trapped animal, but it was more than just panic. It was the growing sense of desperation, the realization that no matter how hard he tried, no matter what he said, it wasn't going to change anything. His life, his freedom, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His thoughts were spinning in circles, but they all pointed to one thing: rage. Rage at the system, rage at Judge Ellis, and ultimately, rage at himself. How had it come to this? The last few months of his life had been a blur of poor decisions and empty promises. But now, here in this moment, it felt like his entire existence was about to be erased. The finality of it all was too much to bear. The prosecutor, Leslie Hayes, was speaking again. Her voice seemed distant, like a soft buzz in the background, but Charles could barely hear her over the deafening noise in his mind. It was as if the walls of the courtroom were pressing in on him, the faces of the spectators all blurring into one collective stare. Everything seemed to move in slow motion, his heart thundering in his chest. The only clear thing was Judge Ellis's unwavering gaze, boring into him, unblinking, unfeeling. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, burning his insides. His breaths became shallow and quick. The anger surged within him, uninvited and overwhelming. There was no turning back now. He wanted to scream, to lash out at the people who had cornered him, to do something, anything, to regain control. But in that moment, as the prosecutor's voice continued droning on, something snapped. Without thinking, Without hesitation, Charles stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as it flew back behind him. The courtroom gasped as he took a step forward, his body tense with the kind of fury that only someone who felt cornered could possess. His fists were clenched, his knuckles white. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice ragged, cracking with raw emotion. The sound of his outburst echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls and causing a ripple of discomfort in the onlookers. It wasn't just a shout, it was a scream of frustration, of desperation, and of a man who had completely lost control. Judge Ellis didn't flinch. She remained seated, her gaze still locked on him, her face unreadable. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The spectators were no longer passive. They were alert, their eyes darting from Charles to the judge. Even the bailiff tensed, his hand hovering over his holster. Charles took another step forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You don't get it," he muttered, his voice barely more than a growl. "You don't know what it's like to be stuck in a hole with no way out." And then, in a moment of pure, unrestrained fury, he lunged forward. His hand shot out, aiming directly at Judge Ellis. It wasn't a well-thought-out move. It wasn't strategic. It was pure rage, a desperate attempt to break free, to make someone feel his pain. The room exploded in chaos. Gasps, cries of alarm, and the frantic shuffling of feet echoed in every corner of the courtroom. But in the midst of it all, Judge Ellis's reaction was the last thing Charles had expected. But before anyone could fully process the shock of his actions, Judge Ellis made her next move, and it left everyone in the room completely stunned. In an instant, the room descended into a frenzy. The sound of Charles's feet hitting the floor as he lunged forward was drowned out by the collective gasp of the courtroom. The bailiff moved to intercept, but it was Judge Ellis who acted first. Her calm, unwavering presence was something no one in that room could have anticipated, least of all Charles. As Charles's hand reached toward her, there was a blur of motion. In one smooth, almost imperceptible movement, Judge Ellis raised her hand and pointed directly at him. It wasn't a gesture of intimidation, but a deliberate signal, sharp, precise, and without hesitation. The force of the motion stunned everyone. The speed with which she responded caught Charles off guard, leaving him frozen in place for a split second, his anger momentarily redirected by sheer disbelief. But that wasn't the end. In the very next moment, the bailiff lunged at Charles, grabbing him by the shoulders and pulling him back. But Judge Ellis didn't stop there. She stood up from her chair with such authority that it silenced the entire courtroom, as if the mere act of her rising commanded everyone to listen. Her voice, when it came, was not the harsh reprimand one might expect. Instead, it was calm, controlled, yet filled with a quiet intensity that reverberated through the room. "Mr. Whittaker," Judge Ellis began, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "you seem to believe that losing control will grant you power, but in reality, it only confirms your weakness." Her words were simple, but they had an undeniable weight. The courtroom fell silent, save for the muffled sounds of the bailiff holding Charles back. His chest heaved, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fury. The rage that had consumed him moments before now seemed distant, a fading echo in the presence of the judge's calm authority. Judge Ellis didn't take her eyes off of him as she continued. "You've chosen this path for yourself, and now you want to blame others for the consequences. You are responsible for your actions, Mr. Whittaker. No one else, and you will answer for them." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the kind of truth that was impossible to ignore. Charles could feel the heat of his anger dissipating, replaced by something else, something unsettling. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, but it was the undeniable realization that he had made a grave mistake, one that he couldn't undo. And worse still, his attack had only solidified his guilt in the eyes of everyone present. The room was still. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the judge's demeanor, so composed and resolute, commanded a respect that felt almost tangible. She was in control of herself, of the room, and of the situation. It was clear now that she wasn't just a judge because of her qualifications. She was a judge because of her strength, her wisdom, and her unwavering sense of justice. Charles stood there, his body tense and his face red with the remnants of his anger. But for the first time in this trial, He wasn't just fighting the system. He was fighting himself. The realization hit him harder than anything he had expected. It wasn't the judgment of the court he feared anymore. It was the judgment of his own conscience. The bailiff stepped back, his grip on Charles loosening. For a moment it seemed like Charles might collapse under the weight of the realization. But Judge Ellis wasn't finished. "Take him into custody," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But let it be known that this will not be a moment of weakness for me, nor will it be for the justice we stand for." The words were final. There was no room for argument, no space left for defiance. Charles's outburst, though an expression of frustration and rage, had been met with the kind of calm strength that only a few could truly embody. Judge Ellis had not only maintained control of the courtroom, she had redefined what it meant to hold power in a situation like this. But as Charles was escorted from the courtroom, the question lingered in the air. What would happen next? Would this turn of events change the course of the trial? Or had it sealed his fate once and for all? As Charles was escorted out of the courtroom, the tension in the air didn't immediately dissipate. The room was thick with shock, yet it was also marked by a profound respect for the way Judge Naomi Ellis had handled the situation. In an instant, she had gone from a quiet figure of authority to the undeniable force that everyone in the room would remember. Her poise, her strength, and her ability to maintain control despite the chaos was something no one would forget anytime soon. But for Charles Whittaker, the shock of his outburst was only the beginning. After a brief pause, Judge Ellis sat back down at her bench. She didn't allow the moment to linger. She knew that the trial was far from over, and now the stakes had somehow risen. What had started as a simple court session now carried a weight of its own, a tension that would follow every move, every word from here on out. The spectators, who had witnessed Charles's attack, now sat in stunned silence. Some whispered among themselves, no doubt talking about what had just transpired. The court reporter, her hands steady as ever, had captured every word, every gesture. She was an observer, but even she couldn't hide the look of disbelief on her face. No one could. Judge Ellis turned her attention back to the case. Her voice, when it cut through the stillness, was calm and unwavering. "We will proceed," she stated simply, but with a weight that seemed to settle over everyone in the room. "The actions of Mr. Whittaker will not deter this court from its duties. We are here for justice, and that is what will prevail." The words were clear. This was not about one man's outburst. This was about something larger. Justice in its purest form was bigger than any one person, any one trial, and she would ensure that it would be served, no matter the cost. But the courtroom wasn't the same anymore. The energy had shifted. The respect for Judge Ellis was palpable, but so was the fear. Charles's attempt to break the order of the room hadn't only failed, it had inadvertently united everyone under the banner of the law. It was as if they had all been reminded, in that brief moment of chaos, what real power looked like. As the prosecutor, Leslie Hayes, regained her composure, she spoke again, her voice still firm, but now carrying a slight edge. "Your Honor," she began, "we would like to proceed with the next witness. The victim in Mr. Whittaker's most recent assault is prepared to testify." Judge Ellis nodded once, her gaze never leaving the prosecutor. She was resolute. "Proceed," she said, her words clipped but unmistakable. The courtroom was still electric with the remnants of the chaos, but as the victim took the stand, the reality of the trial set back in. The victim was a middle-aged woman, shaking as she gave her testimony, recounting the fear she had felt when Charles had assaulted her during the theft. It was a story filled with pain, filled with the kind of helplessness that made the entire room feel it. As the woman spoke, her eyes never left Charles, who now sat silently in the back of the room, his shoulders hunched in shame. Despite the gravity of the testimony, there was something different in the air now. It was as though the courtroom had gained a renewed sense of purpose. The entire room seemed more focused, more driven. Judge Ellis's strength had sparked something deeper in everyone present. Justice was not a game. It was a duty, and it would be upheld. As the victim finished her testimony, the silence was deafening. Charles didn't look at her. He couldn't. His mind was elsewhere, swirling with the consequences of his actions. He had attacked a judge, His fate, already sealed, now felt even more inescapable. Judge Ellis, with a slow and deliberate motion, returned her gaze to Charles. "Mr. Whittaker," she began, her voice cutting through the heavy silence, "your actions in this courtroom have only confirmed what many of us already knew. Your disregard for authority, your lack of respect for the law, but what you failed to realize is that the law is not something that bends to your whims. It will prevail, and it will be your reckoning." But in that moment, Charles realized the truth of her words. His defiance had sealed his fate. He wasn't just up against the law, he was up against a force far greater than himself. As the court session adjourned for the day, the hum of quiet conversations filled the room. People were still processing the events they had just witnessed. Some were shaken by Charles Whittaker's outburst. Others were in awe of how Judge Naomi Ellis had handled it. The courtroom was no longer just a place for legal proceedings. It had transformed into a space where power, control, and justice had been put to the ultimate test. And in that test, it was clear who had won. Charles was taken into custody, his body still tense with the aftermath of his rash actions. The anger that had driven him just hours before was now replaced with an unsettling silence. His thoughts raced, but no matter how fast his mind moved, there was no escaping the consequences of what he had done. He had attacked a judge, something that not only deepened the charges against him, but also turned the trial into something entirely new. He had become the embodiment of his own worst fears, a man out of control, trapped in the very mess he had created. As he sat in the holding cell, he replayed the events over and over in his mind. He had let his frustration boil over, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he could scare his way out of this. But it was Judge Ellis's calm response that haunted him now. How had she maintained such control? How had she, with just a few words and a look, made him feel smaller than he ever had before? She hadn't shouted. She hadn't lost her composure. She had simply spoken the truth, a truth he hadn't been ready to hear. And that truth had shattered him. The weight of his actions was far greater than he had imagined. What he had thought would be a final act of defiance had in reality been the final nail in his own coffin. In that single moment, he had gone from being a man with the possibility of redemption to someone whose future was already written. Meanwhile, Judge Ellis returned to her chambers, the chaos of the courtroom fading behind her. She had done what needed to be done. She hadn't just maintained order in the courtroom, she had shown the kind of strength that went beyond the law. She had reminded everyone in that room what true justice looked like. She didn't need to raise her voice or lose her temper. Her authority was something earned, not given. Her years of experience had prepared her for this moment, and she had proven that in ways no one could ignore. As she sat down at her desk, she took a deep breath. She didn't feel any relief. There was no satisfaction in putting someone in their place. Justice wasn't about winning or losing. It was about ensuring fairness, and it was a responsibility she took seriously every day. Her thoughts drifted for a moment to the many cases she had overseen in her career. She had seen the worst of humanity, but she had also witnessed redemption and change. She had sentenced criminals, yes, but she had also seen many come out of prison and rebuild their lives. It wasn't the judgment that defined her. It was the belief that the law had the power to correct, to heal, and to offer second chances. Charles Whittaker was no exception. His outburst hadn't changed the facts of his case, but it had revealed something deeper. A man who had lost his way and needed to face the consequences of his actions. Judge Ellis knew that his journey wasn't over yet. There would be more hearings, more moments of truth, and more decisions to be made. But the path forward for Charles was clear. He had to face himself first before he could face the law. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the courthouse building, Judge Ellis stood up from her desk. She had done her job, and she had done it well. But more importantly, she had done it with the kind of integrity that made her proud of the work she had chosen to do. For Judge Ellis, it wasn't just about the trials she presided over. It was about making a difference, one decision at a time. And sometimes, that difference was made not with a gavel, but with the quiet power of composure and truth. As for Charles, his journey was far from over. But now, he would have to face the consequences. Not just in the courtroom, but within himself. Judge Naomi Ellis's strength and unwavering commitment to justice show us that true power doesn't come from losing control. It comes from the ability to stand firm and stay grounded, no matter the circumstances. The story of Charles Whittaker serves as a stark reminder that our actions have consequences, and we must be accountable for the choices we make. If you found this story impactful, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more real-life stories of strength, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Judge Ellis's response changed the course of the trial? Let us know how you feel about the role of composure in maintaining authority. Don't forget to like and share this video with others who could benefit from hearing this lesson.